Today we are going to go into comparing the formal types of democracy that are being practiced. The key factor in democracies, of course, is elections, the mechanism for choosing a policy or a candidate in which all adult citizens are allowed to participate. That's one of the key important components of a democratic system. Of course, another requirement for democracy is a set of basic rights: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, certain rights that cannot even be taken away through electoral process. We'll deal with those later. But today we are going to look at some formal systems of elections, because there are different ways of conducting elections. That really brings us to the design of constitutions, because it is the constitution that defines the democratic rights, and also it's the constitution that says what kind of electoral procedures would be used to make collective decisions. How do we determine the winner of an election process? So what is it, why does constitution matter? Take a look at this graph. On one hand, you have the economic system, which in a capitalist system is predominantly a group of markets that are operating within a political system, political and legal system, correct? You have markets. Now, the markets have outcomes. How markets operate determines how much money, how much profit the different groups in society are going to make. But citizens and economic actors are aware that foreign markets operate within a legal political system. So they are sensitive to the rules of the game. Therefore, you can see that based on how they think politics might affect the outcome for themselves or for their social and economic class, they are interested in manipulating or influencing the domain of policy making. They are interested in the design of the Constitution. So we say that even at the point where, or in a level where people want to design or reform the Constitution of their country, they're looking at how it will affect the outcome. Different social classes, economic classes say, if we change the design in this direction, how is that going to affect me? We talked about an example of that in Mexico, where they had approved a reform so that the judges would be elected rather than being appointed. But why was it so sensitive and there were protests? Because every group in society thinks about what will this change do for me? We do have some empty seats here. If anyone likes to come here, you're welcome to come sit here. Okay, so at that level, the Constitution is designed, and it's the Constitution that determines how voting process takes place, what are the basic rights, how different branches of government interact with each other. Once you have the rules of the game in Constitution, then you have political competition in society. And based on the balance of power among various political groups, policies are made and laws are made. And those laws affect the markets and affect the outcome and distribution of wealth, distribution of income, distribution of economic and political power. And this is an ongoing, continuous dynamic process. Okay? So based on this, we see that when we look at democracies, we have certain categories of electoral systems. And we are going to see what are those electoral systems today, and we are going to see how they affect the economic process and economic activity in the society. So that's the dynamic process of how people have an interest in political institutions and how they try to manipulate it in order to affect the environment, the legal environment of the market systems, which affects them. Okay, so the world has moved towards democratic systems. Many countries call themselves democracies, but there are different constitutional forms in democracies. Here are some examples of how we can categorize the democracies. You have parliamentary systems, which are common in Europe, very popular in Europe. And then you have another form of democracy are presidential systems. The difference between them is that in parliamentary systems, the voters elect the members of the legislature, which belong to different parties, and any group in the legislature that has a majority or can form a majority is going to select the executive branch. So in England, the Prime Minister is not selected by the vote of people. People vote for the Parliament, and then the group that has the majority, generally one of the dominant parties, the leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister. In presidential system, the voters vote directly for the president and for the Parliament or the Congress, which is the case in the United States. Therefore, you could have some kind of independence between who is the president and which party dominates the Congress or the legislature. So those are two different systems, and we see these examples all around. And then when you have a mixture of both, where the choice of president is influenced by direct vote of the people, but also the approval of the majority of parliament, that becomes semi-presidential and different forms. But the key factor is to identify or differentiate between parliamentary systems and presidential systems. So that's one dimension of democracies. The other one is how the electoral process works. And generally we say that we have two types of election processes. One of them is the majoritarian, also known as plurality form. The other one is proportional. In majoritarian system, you have a number of candidates. Any candidate that wins 51% of the vote would be the winner. Okay? And generally this is used in political systems where you have districts, and from each district you are going to select one candidate. So candidates compete for one position, one outcome. In proportional system, how does proportional system work? Who likes to tell us what is that kind of political system? Our competition takes place among parties. And then people vote for a party. At the end of the day, the shares of votes are counted. Party A has 36% of the votes. Party B has 20%. Party C has 15%. Based on their percentage of the vote, they are allocated seats. So the number of seats allocated to each party is directly proportional to the vote that that party has received. So people are not voting for one person, people are voting for parties. But what is the difference? Even if you have a party that earns, let's say, 10% of the vote, you end up sending some representatives to the legislature, because representation is based on proportion. In majority system, that's not the case. In majority system, it's a competition, and only the winner, the representative of the winner party or the winning candidate, can make it to the legislature. So you see that the outcome is different. When you have proportional, even a smaller parties would have a chance to have a small number of seats in the legislature, correct? But in majoritarian systems, where the vote is for one individual, political parties are excluded, the smaller political parties. They would never have a chance to have a representation, because even though they might be competing for many years, there might be old parties, if their position does not capture majority vote, they will never end up sending any candidates to the Now they might compete in many districts, but if they are minority in every district, they would not have a chance. So these are two different systems, and they have different outcomes. We can talk about the fairness, which one of them is more representative, which one of them is more efficient, but they are two different outcomes. Okay? So, generally when you have a majoritarian system, the outcome is that a single party will dominate and would be able to win, would have a chance to just rule as a single party in the country. In proportional system, because you tend to have many parties, since they have a chance to go to legislature, people form parties. In proportional system, you would have multiple parties competing. And as a result, more often, you end up in a situation that representatives of no party make up 51% of the legislature. And what is the result of that? No single party has majority to form a government. Because in order to form a government, you need majority support in the parliament. That is the rule in terms of legislature. So you end up with coalition government. Parties have to negotiate to come together and say we 53% of the representatives have formed a coalition. So when you have a situation where more often the government is a coalition government with multiple parties, then you have more political instability, meaning that the government rules for 8 months, for 10 months, and then there is the disagreement between two of the parties members of the coalition. One of them pulls out. When they come to the parliament to approve the next bill, the next proposal, majority is lost, and then the government collapses, because as soon as the government cannot have majority on an issue, then another government has to be formed. So that's one equality in that situation. But the advantage of proportional is that it has a better representation of the people. Because if you have a group of people who are only 10% or 5% of society, and they would like their voice to be heard and they would like to be present in the parliament, their small party has a chance to, let's say, capture 5% of the vote and have 5% of the legislature. But that small party would have no chance of representation in a majoritarian system. In Europe, you have green parties. Okay. You have all kinds of small environmental parties, but not in the United States, because the United States is not proportional. Another consequence is that the government, in terms of stability and life of an elected government, is higher under majoritarian rule versus parliamentary rule, proportional rule. And then there is some difference in terms of how people go about rent seeking, how special interest groups behave. We are going to look at that later. Any questions, comments? Okay. So here is a more detailed table that shows different type of systems. And you don't have to learn all of these specific types. The key really to understand is that you have a plurality majority type and proportional representation. But among these, the type of, for example, majority voting system that is commonly practiced and also in the United States is this one called FPTP, which means first past the post. In other words, you have an election, anyone who reaches a threshold would win. Often it is 50%. So among the candidates, even the first round of elections, one candidate gets 51%, that's it. Election is over. If no candidate gets to 51%, then you have a runoff. Two candidates with the highest votes will do another election, which is what happens in the United States, for example, in the primaries. And then any one of them that gets the majority will. So this is familiar to most of you because I think even in high school when they practice elections, this is the method that's used for all kinds of activities. And then of course you have the proportional system, and among the different types of processes in the proportional representation, the least system is most popular and is practiced in most countries. And the least proportional representation means that we said that in proportional it's the parties that compete, correct? So each party releases a list of candidates. And then people who vote, if they like to vote for a party, in some mechanisms they simply choose the members of the list from that party. That automatically, when the members of the party's list are elected, that credit goes to their party. So in Europe, in many parts of Latin America, in Asia, that is the standard practice. So these two are the most popular ones. But I have here the names of each one of them for you so that you can know exactly what they are and in case you like to learn more about them. But for your tests, you don't have to worry about these. This is the key issue to understand, and then just the FPTP and the list system. Okay, so let's look at some of these and see how they operate. Under majoritarian electoral systems, you usually have a situation where the voters belong to a district and a single candidate would be elected. So that's why we call it a single member. So among the list of candidates, the voter votes for one individual. Whoever gets 50% of the votes among the candidates is a winner. In some of these, which are not really that common, Plurality is enough, meaning that it doesn't matter if you get 50%. All that matters is that you have the most votes. Even if it is 40% or 30%, you are going to win anyways. Okay, but in many others, if no one wins 50% in the first round, it goes for the second round until one of them is elected. Because in the second round there is always two candidates, so obviously the outcome is that one of them is going to be a winner. Okay, so what are the advantages of this? This mechanism leads to political stability and the government is really the government of one party that holds the majority, therefore it is more stable. The negatives or the cons is that minority parties are not represented. Often in these political systems, you have two political parties that dominate. And smaller parties do not even get created. So then you have political parties that in themselves they are coalitions of multiple groups, multiple ideological tendencies who have come together because if they don't become part of a large party, they will not have any representation. The United States, for God knows how long, even from the beginning of the creation of the country, two parties have dominated. And it is a very stable political system where these two political parties always dominate. There are a lot of small parties, local parties, but they never make it to the Congress. They just exist as political groups. They campaign, they have their issues and anything, but not really that much of a representation. Because the system is designed in this way. Then you have the fact that sometimes you have to do two elections because no clear winner is emerged. Therefore, then you have the cost of time and the resources that have to be spent in order to have two elections. Okay. Now, another type of majority voting electoral system is what we call the block voting. In block voting, you have multiple members, and the voters are allowed to choose as many candidates as there are seats. It is still a majoritarian voting system, but if, for example, from Massachusetts, there are going to be 5 representatives in the parliament, in the Congress, people see a list of maybe 20, 25, 15 candidates when they go to vote, and from them they choose 5 of them. So every voter votes, so has 5 to choose from. And then the votes are counted. Whoever gets the largest number is elected. And because there are 3 representations or 5 representations, the 5 people with the most vote automatically are elected. All right. So to give you an example, imagine there are 6 candidates and they're competing for 3 seats. In this system, each voter selects 3 names. You don't just choose 1 name, you choose 3 names. And then the 3 candidates with the largest votes will win. And that's how the outcome in the election is conducted. Questions, comments? Okay. What about proportional representation? We said this is where you vote for a party or candidates that are associated with a party, and then we count the votes for a party. And that determines how many seats a party gets. So, there are multiple members, so you vote for a list. And the parties gain seats in proportion to the percentage of the vote that they receive. And this is interesting. This kind of election has two subcategories. One of them is called the open list, the other one is a closed list. In open list, if you just take a moment to read that so that you don't look at your laptops, you see that in an open list, the citizens vote for individuals within a party, meaning that, for example, the Labour Party has a list of candidates. You choose among them, let's say, 5 of them. You have voted for Labour Party, but among the candidates you have also expressed your preference. That's an open list. So those votes are counted, and there are two outcomes. What is the number one? We know how many votes each party gets. Number two, we can count the number of votes for each name, candidate name, for each party. Therefore, the voters have also elected the representatives of each party. What's the difference with the closed list? In closed list, when a voter goes to vote, all they see is the name of the parties. They do not see the name of candidates. Then the vote count determines the proportion of the total vote that each party gets. And then the party leaders are the ones who select the representatives. So representatives do not have any contact with people directly. What are the consequences for corruption, for campaign, for behavior of politicians? Under closed list, you're not really dealing with people, you're dealing with party leaders, correct? Because it's the performance of the party that matters to people. Even in a parliament, the party can decide to pull one person out, put someone else in, and members of a party in the parliament are obligated, they are under obligation to vote when the parliament votes on a policy according to the guideline of the party. So it's the party that has all the power. So if you are an interest group and you want to buy votes for a policy, the corruption that we talked about before, you don't have to wine and dine individual members of the parliament. All you need to do is to have good relations with the central leadership of each party, especially the party that is in power. So the design of the Constitution in terms of electoral process really matters, and it also affects the behavior not only of the voters, but all economic agents, all political groups, interest groups that would like to influence the legislature. All people are selfish and they approach the parliament or the legislature for their benefit, but the strategy they use and how they operate depends on the system. Who holds the power? And you interact with them. Very good. Questions? Okay, there is another one that's interesting, but that gets too complicated. So you just can always Google that one later. So, what are the advantages of the proportional representation? It has better representation of all parties compared to majoritarian system. Parties tend to be more ideological. You don't have to come to the median voter. All you need to do is to get vote of those who believe in your ideology. So it would be easier and convenient for parties to express their ideology. Then you see ideological division in society on all dimensions, on all issues. You don't see that in majoritarian systems. And it creates multiple number of parties in society because our preferences are diverse, our interests are diverse, so we don't have to create coalitions in very large parties that really are very focused on very broad ideas. We tend to create parties that are more specific on topics that you prefer. I mean, the citizens, the voters. So, in a proportional representation system, you're likely to see 4 or 5 parties that are active with diversity of ideologies. In majoritarian systems, it's generally 2 dominant parties. What are the negatives or cons? It is less stable. Policy is vulnerable to change because, remember, governments are often coalition governments, and coalitions can fail, and then you would have policy reversal. If suddenly there is a change in sentiment, you will quickly see the impact on the parliament, and then you have again policy reversal. So you have less policy stability. And then if voters lose control of political influence once parties are in office. Okay. So because it is really the party that has control, rather than the legislatures being directly representative to a district. So in the United States, an elected person knows that at the end of the day, if he or she wants to be re-elected, he has to go back to a group of people as constituents. That's not the case with party system. You don't really deal with the specific regions. It's the party dealing with the entire nation. In former Yugoslavia, does anyone know about Yugoslavia, the country before Balkan Wars? It was a country that was created after World War I. It was multi-ethnic. They had a leader, Marshal Tito. His name was Tito. The country worked fine as a multi-ethnic country. They had the Serbs, Croatians, Bosnians. And then he died. And then they wanted to keep it together. So they decided on having a rotational president. They had one person from each of these 5 ethnic groups serving for 1 year as president. They tried it for a few years. It didn't even become 5 years. Then the country broke into a very bloody civil war with a lot of violence. And it was finally with US intervention that it was partitioned into several countries. So sometimes that kind of arrangement doesn't work, but Switzerland is an exception. Very successful country, very well-functioning political system for their own people. Very well. Okay, so here is an overview of what has been practiced. Of course, this is the 2005 data. There is perhaps more up-to-date data as well. But notice that really some of them are commonly practiced. The others are occasionally an exceptional. But you can also see the difference in the form of formal democratic system among different regions of the world. Which type is more popular has to do with the history and experience. It also has to do with the European colonial influence on Africa, on Asia, on Latin America, so that often the countries that were colonized after they gained independence, if they moved towards democracy, they adopted the same system as the country that had colonial experience there. But let's take a look. The first past the post, which is just a majority system similar to what is practiced in the United States, is more popular in Latin America and North America and Africa, when you look at it. But maybe not majority of that, because it's only 17 here. But look at the case here. At least it's one of the more popular ones in Americas. And then when you come to Europe, the least proportional representation is most popular. Look at Europe, Western Europe, the oldest democracies in Europe. And then you have a group of new democracies that emerged after the collapse of Soviet Union. Those are democracies of Eastern Europe, and all of them adopted the system that was already in place in Western Europe. And it was in a way necessary because they all combined to create the European Union, which is now close to 31 countries. But you can see the popularity of each type of system in here. As I said before, first past the post is one of the most popular with 47, but globally it is the proportional representation that is most popular worldwide. 70 out of 199 countries that have formal elections use the proportional representation system. Now, here you have 199 countries that have electoral systems in their constitution. It doesn't mean they are all real democracies. It means they all have elections. Some countries have elections and hold them regularly, but they do not have other aspects of what we call requirements for democratic systems. Very good. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the outcomes of different types of systems. So one of the things that you are interested in is the vote-seeking activities. Vote-seeking is another way of saying rent-seeking, we could refer to it as well. The candidates, if we look at the candidates that are running, their strategy, their campaign strategy has to do with how the system works. So we see under plurality system or majority system, you have candidates running for one district and one of them would be elected. The party influence is minimal. It is simply the individual that is at the front as the candidate. So clearly the personality of the individual is important. It's the personality and the person that matters. And that you can see in US elections. You hardly see US elections talk about the position of we the Republicans. It's the candidate that they talk about. President Trump's plan, Kamala Harris's proposals, things of that nature. So that focus on personality and person is an outcome of competing in majority system. In proportional representation systems, it is the popularity of the party programs that is more important. So when they campaign in PR systems, the focus tends to be on what the party has accomplished in terms of, we are the party that brought you the welfare program, we are the party that reduced the taxes, and the accomplishments of the party. Because we saw that individual is not important. It's the parties that compete against each other. So what is the result of that? During the campaign, what we call vote-seeking activity, political campaign, in PR systems, the competitors, which are parties, focus more on economic programs, on agenda. In majority systems, it is personality, it is showing the candidate with family, candidate's personal achievement, rather than purely focusing on what has been accomplished in the past. Okay. Now, one of the issues that has emerged recently after the collapse of former Soviet Union is that a number of democracies emerged, and democracy became a very, very popular ideal political system. But in practice, some countries that adopted formal constitution of a democracy did not become democracies. They simply had elections, but some aspects of the political system were autocratic. And what do we mean by that? What I mean is that the ruling politicians were able to manipulate the process, the electoral process, in order to stay in power, or to perhaps keep some of their candidates out, or manipulate the vote in favor of certain elements. Anything that deviates from what is considered a fair and transparent electoral process. So this has happened in many countries. Russia, for example, the constitution is fully democratic, but when you look at the actual outcome of elections, we see that Vladimir Putin and his team have manipulated the electoral process to stay in power, and they have eliminated some of the competition. The political parties that are in opposition are often weak or marginalized, and as you might know, some opponents have been assassinated or they just vanish, disappear. So that becomes an electoral autocracy, because regular elections are held just like any other democracy. Okay. So that is the definition. And empirical studies show that plurality and majoritarian systems are more vulnerable to be abused in electoral autocracies. You see, this is a contradiction in terms, right? Because you have elections and you have autocracy. Autocracy means ruling by force, by just one individual, without attention to the will of others. Why is that the case? Why is that we are saying that plurality systems are more vulnerable? The reason is that in autocracy you have individuals looking for power. Okay? Therefore, when the system allows individuals to run and operate, it is easier to target one individual and marginalize them, come up with some kind of accusation of illegal activity to prevent them from participating in election. It is hard to do that when it is like 3 or 4 parties competing against each other. That is the reason for it. And I hope it makes sense when you think about that. So because parties are better organized to defend themselves than just single individuals running as opposition. Okay, now to see what these look like, and how many countries are actually electoral autocracies. We have a website called, and of course this is, I'm sure you are familiar with this, Our World in Data, which has a wealth of data on all kinds of parameters. It has some information on political systems. And if you go to this website, you can see the distribution of countries according to their political system. I have here the map for 2023, and you can see that it recognizes three types of political systems: electoral democracies, which are actually functioning democracies shown in blue. Then you have electoral autocracies, political systems that have elections, have some nominal form of democracy, or perhaps they have autocracy at central government, but allow for democratic elections at local government, because local governments are not a threat to the power, to the dictator, for example, at the top. Therefore, people are allowed to truly elect their representative preferred politicians for local governments. So you can see that although the number of countries that are considered completely non-democratic, the dark brown, is relatively small, many countries that have some type of democratic system are not pure democracies. They are electoral autocracies, according to this categorization. And of course, I encourage you to visit this website on your own. It's dynamic. You can simply change the date, and it automatically shows you how the political systems around the world have evolved over time for over 200 years. Very good. Okay, so what are the sort of ideal attributes of a political system? In a very broad category, we want to talk about the political system. So here we're going to look at two dimensions, the dimensions that we introduced at the beginning of the class. Okay? What are those two dimensions? First of all, type of government, where you have presidential or parliamentarian system, and we said what was the difference between them, and the electoral process, or majoritarian or proportional. So in a way you can create a matrix in that. And then we can talk about what are the advantages or disadvantages of the country that belongs to each of these four categories. Because you could have the country fall into any of these four cells. They don't have to be excluded from each other. All right? So, then what are the criteria for evaluating the quality of a democracy? And here we're just thinking about it. If you were to say what kind of society I would like to live in, I think two things are very important. One of them is that we have a system where the elected officials in a democracy feel that they are accountable to the people. So when there is a policy that doesn't work, people at the very top, the president, the head of the parliament, can face the country, and they can be held accountable as a single individual. Because that accountability creates an incentive to be efficient and to pay attention to the preferences of the public. And also, we would like to have good representativeness or representation. We just saw that in majoritarian system you have political stability, but the small parties and the small ideologies are excluded from power. They do not really have any influence in parliament, which is the center of policy making. On the other hand, proportional systems have better representation, even if an ideology enjoys 5% popularity in society, it will have 5% of the legislatures in the political system. Do they seem like good attributes to have in a political system? Because after all, we want the government to represent the people. But also the government to be responsive. And there is a little bit of conflict between these two dimensions, because if you want to increase one of them, you might have to compromise on the other one. That's why we have these two dimensions in terms of two criteria. If they fully overlap, then it's just really one criteria we have to worry about. So, when we look at these accountability and representativeness, and look at these four cells for the kind of government, political system democracies can have, here is what we observe. In terms of accountability, we see that accountability is stronger under majoritarian rule. Because you have a president that is elected by the people, and that president, for re-election, has to really pay attention to the people, so that when you come back in 4 years, you have to account for what you have done. In the parliamentary system, there is no single individual. Prime ministers change, there is coalition government, you have multiple parties. They can all deflect responsibility, especially in a coalition system. Also, accountability is stronger under presidential regime, because president is directly elected by the people. In the parliamentary system, the president is elected by the parties depending on their portion of the votes in the parliament. Okay. What about representativeness? Clearly, based on what we explained, representativeness is stronger under proportional rule. And we saw that, we don't need to talk about that anymore. Similarly, between parliamentary system and presidential system, I'm looking at this dimension, representativeness is stronger under parliamentary regime. So now we see that we have a trade-off. We have two positive criteria, and we would like to maximize on both, but you have to have a trade-off among these various democratic systems. And that's why around the world, depending on historical experience, we observe these diversities. You can find many countries among democracies in each one of these cells. Each one of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. Okay. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit about the impact of the type of democratic system among those four combinations on economic outcomes. Because beside the first graph, how the choice of constitution ultimately affects policy, and policy affects the operation of the economic system. So what do we have here? We have different constitutional rules are associated with different responses to important economic and political events. How responsible the parliament, the president feel in terms of economic stability, whether they want to bring down inflation, whether unemployment full employment is a priority is affected by the political systems. Okay. So now imagine we have a political system operating. Everybody knows the rules of elections, the rights of individuals. So what happens? Will their choice, once we have the system going under different constitutions, will their choice of policy respond depend on their constitutions? When a country must reduce government spending, and this is based on empirical analysis, at the end of this PowerPoint, you see a table of empirical statistical analysis that supports what is being said here, but that's not part of the lecture. So some of the key decisions that might be influenced by the political system. Sometimes governments have to make hard choices for reducing spending, cutting budget, which is unpopular. And politicians survive on popularity and approval of the voters. So that's the challenge. So what do? The argument is that when there is need for government spending to be reduced, presidential regimes delay budget reductions until after the elections. Parliamentary regimes don't postpone as much. Why? Because the president, who has some kind of control, wants to be re-elected. So they might want to postpone any major cuts until they are re-elected, and then do the cuts. If you look at government spending cuts or reforms, it's always in the year after an election, because everything was postponed so that people would feel good. Usually there is a tendency to increase expenditure in the years ahead of election to create economic boom, good feeling. The president, if he has the power, will do that. And then, obviously, they realize that there is a huge budget deficit. They have to deal with that. When do we cut? After the election. Then we cut for a year. We have 2 years of people feeling unhappy. Then we'll approach the next election. We'll raise it again. Okay. Then our statistics observation shows all countries tend to tax cuts in the election years, because all parties that are in power or hold the majority would like to appease the voters by tax cuts if they can. Welfare state programs are expanded in the proximity of elections. What are welfare state programs? Subsidy benefits to families, any kind of program that directly benefits the households. If they are going to do some forgiveness for student loans, for example, let's do it ahead of elections. But these are often done only in democracies with proportional electoral rules. So perhaps some explanation is needed, and the studies are available to explain that. But when we observe and compare the behavior of parties in the election year, the expansion of welfare state programs, for example, housing subsidy is one of these examples. Housing subsidy for low-income families. Low-interest loans for first-time home buyers, another form of welfare programs. Proportional electoral systems with proportional representation tend to do this near the elections, so that they can influence the election outcome. So we're not going deep into explanation, but this is what the statistics show us when we take data and compare the policy behavior of different parties under different political systems. Okay, what else can we say? Under majoritarian elections, for example, in the United States, there is a tendency to induce a smaller welfare state than proportional elections under European democracies. In a way, this argues that having a president perhaps makes it easier to resist populist pressures to expand welfare state programs. When we look at European countries versus the United States, we see that they generally tend to have a much larger welfare support programs, all kinds of government support in return for higher taxes, of course, but they are also the countries that are systems of proportional representation. So that in a way supports the argument. Welfare states, overall government spending and budget deficits are smaller in majoritarian countries. So if this is valid, it means that fiscal discipline is easier to achieve under majoritarian systems compared to parliamentarian systems. A switch from parliamentarian to majoritarian system, if there is a reform, a political reform, has the following consequences. This is from an empirical study. Overall government spending will decrease by 5% of GDP. Welfare spending would be 2.2 to 3% smaller as a percentage, and budget deficit is about 2% smaller as a percentage of GDP. All right, and this is just the definition of the welfare state. So you can see that political system really matters in terms of outcome. But it doesn't mean that countries are continuously reforming their political system. Indeed, the number of countries that switch from one form to the other, I think, is very, very small. Very few countries make this huge switch. Countries switch from maybe authoritarian government to one form of democracy or the other, but once they are there, it is very hard to see a major shift from one form to the other. Even though in every country you always hear criticism of the weaknesses that exist in that specific